good afternoon, and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have you join us for an engaging and inspiring hour with Douglas Tallamy as he shares his considerable knowledge and passion about how we all can be part of healing our environment and ecosystems, starting with our own backyards. Let me first introduce myself and the Kent Land Trust as sponsor of this important program. I'm Connie Manis, and I serve as the organization's executive director. The Kent Land Trust is a nonprofit organization based in, you guessed it, Kent, Connecticut. Like our colleagues at land trusts across the nation, our work centers around the protection and care of significant natural habitats and resources. And to this end, we've conserved over 3,000 acres in Kent through outright ownership or by conservation easement since we were incorporated in 1989. 10 of our nature preserves have trails that are open for public use, and we work frequently with local partners to help study and care for Kent's native animal and plant species through educational programs, hands-on restoration projects, and other initiatives. Our goal is to lead by example, practicing best land management on the properties we're responsible for, but also engaging the full community in our work, because 3,000 acres is not enough to secure a healthy ecosystem, because we cannot meet the need alone, and because developed lands, like those around our homes and villages, have a huge role to play that is different from traditional land protection. Last summer, the Kent Land Trust began working to promote the pollinator pathway. We distributed materials and presented workshops about how to foster habitat for native birds and insects in home gardening. We created 3 demonstration sites on our public preserves, and we hung out and talked with people every Friday at the farmers market, during sidewalk sale days, and other public events. And what we found out in doing this is that our community cares a whole lot about birds and bees and very much strives to do the right thing. Discovering all of these allies was wonderful. The camaraderie made us all feel more hopeful and determined. We're pleased to carry on our work on the pollinator pathway this year, starting with today's program. And with your help, we can envision a healthy environment that is supported by our modest interventions to promote, but never harm, the living organisms with which we coexist and that sustain the earth. So shifting gears to some quick housekeeping, I'm guessing that you all have some working knowledge of Zoom at this point. So we request that during Professor Tallamy's presentation, you turn off your video feeds and keep your audio on mute to avoid distractions. Following the presentation, we will have an open Q&A session with video on at your option, at which time we'll ask that you use the control bar to raise your hand, and we'll call on you to come off mute and ask your question. Of course, if questions arise during the presentation, you're also welcome to post those in chat, and we'll make sure they're conveyed. Finally, as you may have noted, we're recording this session and anticipate that it may be used in whole or in part in further publications. Thank you. Douglas Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 104 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His first book, Bringing Nature Home, awakened thousands of readers to the urgent problem of declining wildlife populations due to the disappearance of native plants. And he was awarded, and the book, was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. His subsequent books, including Nature's Best Hope, A New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard, The Nature of Oaks, The Rich Ecology of Our Most Essential Native Trees, and The Living Landscape, Designing for Beauty and Biodiversity in the Home Garden, which is co-authored with Rick Darke, all continue to build on his research as well as show the way forward. Among his awards are the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence, the 2018 AHS V.Y. Morrison Communication Award, and the 2019 Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award. He recently co-founded the nonprofit organization Homegrown National Park with Michelle Alfandari, who lives just next door to Kent in Sharon, Connecticut. We're so grateful that he's able to be with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Douglas Tallamy.
Well, thank you very much, Connie. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Cold and snowy outside, so this is a good thing to do. Let's talk about restoring nature's relationships. But before we do that, we have to talk about what nature's relationships are. Let's start with the resplendent quetzal. This is an endangered bird in the forests of Central America, and it's endangered for one primary reason: it has a very specialized diet. If you don't have fruits of the wild avocado tree, you don't have quetzals. And of course, we've cut down most of the avocado trees. But we figured out not too long ago, you can plant those trees again. You can put them back. That's what these folks are doing here. They're small, but they grow quickly, not too long before they produce those fruits. And it's actually starting to look better for the future of that beautiful bird. If you want to have jaguars, you have to have particular species of palm trees. Why palm trees? Because they make palm nuts. Now, jaguars don't eat palm nuts, but they eat peccaries, and the palm nuts are the favorite food of peccaries. So they're all connected. Specialization, like those examples in the natural world, are the rule. They are not the exception. They're typically associated with food, but they always start with plants. Now, a lot of people think most of the specialized relationships in nature occur in the tropics because so many of the relationships in the tropics are specialized, but we actually have a good deal of specialization up here in the temperate zone as well. And some of the most specialized relationships that have ever evolved anywhere occur right in our yards. This is one of them. This is a female bola spider. She does not spin a web. She simply drops one strand of silk and puts a sticky glob of glue at the bottom there. And the first time I saw her do this, this is a picture in my yard. I told her, you're not going to catch anything. I thought a web would be a much better design. But about 15 seconds later, a moth flew in, got stuck on her sticky glob of glue, and she reeled it in, wrapped it all up, and proved me totally wrong. So she wraps a thin web of silk around it, and then she eats it. But when she's eaten a number of those moths, she will construct an egg mass. It's a very fancy egg mass. And if she gets enough moths, she'll make 2 or 3 of these in a row. What I didn't know is that she did not catch that moth by accident. She was releasing the sex pheromone of that particular species of moths. And I have figured out which moth this particular species of bola spider is attracting. And it turns out it's the bronze cutworm. And I have bronze cutworms in my yard because I've got goldenrod. That's one of their host plants. So very specialized relationship. You won't have the bronze cutworm without goldenrod, and you won't have the bola spiders without bronze cutworms. And every species of bola spider in the world specializes on a particular species of moth. This is Phlox divaricata, very common spring ephemeral in our gardens, and it spreads readily from seed as long as it's pollinated. But if you look at the entrance to the corolla of that flower, it's very, very small. Watch native bees land on these flowers and try to get their mouth parts in there, and they can't do it. So who's pollinating our phlox? Well, it turns out it's day-flying sphinx moths, things like the hummingbird sphinx or the Nessus sphinx or the snowberry clearwing. They have really long tongues, and they sink them deep into the corolla of those flowers. And when they pull them out, they're covered with sticky pollen. And they fly to the next flower, and that's how your phlox gets pollinated. So you can get your phlox pollinated if you have adult snowberry clearwings, and you can have adult snowberry clearwings if you have larval snowberry clearwings, and you can have larval snowberry clearwings if you have coral honeysuckle. That is their native host plant. So not Japanese honeysuckle, but coral honeysuckle. That's the only thing they're going to eat. Even animals we don't think of as having very specialized relationships with plants often do. And I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee, the bird of truth, according to the Cherokees, as a good example. Of course, in Connecticut, you've got the black-capped chickadee, practically the same bird doing the same things. And chickadees are at our feeders right now, eating the seeds that we put out. 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the winter. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they're not exceptions. Most of our birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they are soft. So think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle, it's made of chitin, which is undigestible, and birds don't want a lot of that. And if they're soft, you can stuff the caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. If you've ever watched a parent bird where they're young, they're pretty rough. They just stuff that down there like a plunger. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're also they have the highest content of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate. And birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. Only plants make carotenoids. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential diets or essential components of vertebrate diets. Now, chickadee is not eating plants, particularly when it's reproducing. So where's it getting its carotenoids from? It's getting it from all those insects and spiders that it eats. But carotenoid contents are not equally distributed across bird prey items. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars, and they have far more carotenoids than any other type of bird prey. This is the adult caterpillar here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but it doesn't get any carotenoids when it gets the worm. That information suggests, along with several other studies, that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say that without caterpillars, you're not going to have any chickadees, you're not going to have any other birds that are out there. So the next question is, how many caterpillars does it take to make a chickadee, to make a nest of chickadees? Well, it takes a lot. And I discovered this years ago when I simply wanted to get pictures of chickadees feeding their young. So I put up a chickadee box and set my camera up. And the first thing I noticed is they're bringing in caterpillars really fast. One caterpillar every 3 minutes. Both the male and female are cooperating when they're hunting those caterpillars. So they're working hard and they bring them in quickly. In one 27-minute period when I was standing there, they brought in 30 different caterpillars. How do they do that? By bringing in more than one at a time. And sometimes they bring in a whole bunch. And they're working hard from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. So a lot of caterpillars coming into those nests. The next question I thought about was, how many species of caterpillars does it take to make a chickadee nest? Well, in 3 hours that I was watching them, they brought back 17 different species of caterpillars. Now, this is happening in my yard. Why is that important? Well, if I had just 2 or 3 species of caterpillars in my yard, and it happened to be a bad year for those species, all these populations fluctuate a lot. In good times, they go up, and bad times, they go down. So if I only had a few species and it was a bad year for those species, there wouldn't be nearly enough caterpillars for the poor chickadees. But if I have 17 species or 34 species or 134 species, and this prompted me to start counting the number of species of caterpillars in my yard. I've only done the moths so far. I'm up to 1,140 species of moths in my yard. Then there's plenty of diversity out there. So it doesn't matter if a few species are depressed because of the weather, there will always be enough food for those chickadees. Okay, a guy by the name of Richard Brewer, way back in 1961, wanted to know how many caterpillars chickadees brought in to the nest. And I'm not sure why he wanted to know that, but he sat and he counted the foraging by a number of pairs of chickadees, and he found out that they bring between 390 and 570 caterpillars to the nest every day, depending on the number of chicks of the nest. And they're in the nest for 16 days. So that means they are bringing between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to the nest, just to the point to where the chickadees actually fled, where they leave the nest. And after they fledged, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of chickadee. What if I wanted to make a red-bellied woodpecker? It's 8 times heavier than a chickadee. How many caterpillars does that take? And I don't want just chickadees and red-bellied woodpeckers. I want scarlet tanagers and titmice and blue jays and bluebirds. These are all common birds, tree swallows, common yellowthroats, indigo bunnings and towhees and yellow warblers and thrushes and wrens, cardinals and hummingbirds. And I don't want just one pair of all of them. I want breeding populations. How many caterpillars does that take? It's a big number. But I know what you're thinking. Well, hummingbirds don't eat caterpillars. Well, they eat nectar. Yes, they do eat nectar. But when they're breeding, when they're creating more hummingbirds, you don't make a baby hummingbird out of nectar. 80% of their diet is insects and spiders. And that is true for 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America. They're rearing their young on insects. So if we take those insects away, no baby birds. That's a bit of an exaggeration. We do have a few birds that can rear their young on seeds, but it's very few. So what types of landscapes are capable of producing the diversity and numbers of insects that we're talking about here? Well, to answer this question, now we have to go back to specialized relationships. We have to talk about the most common type of specialized relationship in the world, and that is the relationship between insects and plants. Most of the insects that eat plants can only eat particular plants in a very specialized way. Why is that? Because plants don't want to be eaten. They have made them host plant specialists. They have loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat particular plants for which they've developed very specialized adaptations, specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, specialized behavioral adaptations that minimize the exposure of the insect to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history for all these adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect's locked into eating those particular plants. Let's use the monarch butterfly as an example, because you already know a lot about the monarch butterfly. You know that it's a specialist on milkweeds, and you probably know that milkweeds don't taste good. Don't eat a milkweed. They're filled with cardiac glycosides. If you eat enough milkweeds, it will stop your heart. I used to say it would give you a heart attack, but there was a physician in the audience once who said, no, it doesn't give you a heart attack. It just stops your heart. All right. In any case, it doesn't stop the monarch's heart. And they do have a heart, by the way, because they've got the physiological adaptations to be able to handle that compound. But what about the sticky latex sap that's in milkweed? That's what gives it its common name. When we break open a milkweed vein, all the sticky goo comes out. And if you put it on your finger and hold it up to the air, it will gel. When it's exposed to oxygen, it becomes like chewing gum. And that's its defense. If you get that on, if you're a caterpillar and you get that on your mouth parts, it glues your mouth shut and then you starve to death. Well, monarch butterflies eat milkweeds. How do they do that? How does the caterpillar eat through those leaves without gluing its mouth parts shut? This is what they do. And you can watch this right in your yard. They will crawl onto a leaf. The first thing they do is crawl to the end of the leaf and start eating. And if any latex sap oozes out at all, they'll stop eating immediately, turn around, crawl back up the leaf, and start chewing through the midrib. They chew and they chew till they have completely severed the midrib of that leaf. And what they're doing is blocking the canals that allow the latex sap to flow from this part of the leaf to this part of the leaf. So now this part of the leaf has no latex sap. So then the monarch butterfly turns around, goes back down, and starts to eat the bottom of the leaf, and there's no sap to glue up its mouth parts. Very specialized behavioral adaptation. That, of course, flags the leaf from the weight of the caterpillar. So you can actually drive down the road and look at a milkweed patch and see whether there are caterpillars, monarch caterpillars there, just by looking for these flagged leaves. So that's the good side of specialization. Now the monarch is able to eat a plant that most other insects are not adapted to eat. And that's good as long as there's milkweeds around. The downside of specialization is that now that's all they can eat. They are locked in to milkweeds. And if we take the milkweeds away, we take the monarch away. And that, of course, is what we've done over the last several decades, particularly in the Midwest. Along roadsides, we've taken out the milkweeds and the asters and all the other plants that people call weeds and replaced them with lawn. And in what was it, 2013, that's when the eastern monarch hit its low point. Only 3.6% of the population was left. So now we started big conservation programs to bring the monarch back. And it's starting to work because we're putting the milkweeds back. I don't want you to think it's just caterpillars that are specialists. This is the elderberry beetle, only eats elderberry. The dogbane beetle only eats dogbane. The sumac flea beetle only eats sumac. This is a Korean leaf-footed bug that only eats ash. So if the emerald ash borer takes out all of our ashes, we're going to lose this insect and 94 other species that specialize on ash. So remember, 90% of the insects that are eating plants are host plant specialists. So we've got to, if we're going to have these insects around, we've got to have the plants that they depend on. And we can use this knowledge of host plant specialization to rebuild landscapes wherever we want, in our yards, in our land trusts, wherever we want, by simply recreating the food webs that support all the life that's out there. And I'm going to give you an example from the white-eyed vireo. This is a nest that the vireos built in our yard some years ago. They must have known that in order for me to reconstruct the food web that supports these vireos, I had to take pictures of the caterpillars they were bringing to their young. So they built the nest very low, and it made it nice and convenient for me. So what did I find? I found that the insects they were bringing back, most of them were host plant specialists. This is the blinded sphinx. It's a specialist on black cherry. Now we have a lot of black cherry in our yard, making blinded sphinx moths so the babies get to eat. This caterpillar right here is the chestnut caesura. It's a specialist on viburnum. The only viburnum at our house was viburnum dentatum. And I know that because we planted it. And they're making, that's arrowwood, if I recall. They're making chestnut caesuras and the babies get to eat again. This guy with the white stripe here is the drab prominent. It's a specialist on sycamore. Now, we did not plant any sycamores in our yard, but there was a big wind shortly after we moved in, and it blew in a lot of sycamore seeds from someplace. One of them landed in my cold frame. It germinated, and I'm not very fast at weeding things out. So that tree is now about 80 feet tall, but it's making lots of drab prominence. I don't have any more cold frame, but I've got drab prominence and the babies get to eat again. So on and on we go. This is the 8-spotted forester moth, a specialist on grape. We have a lot of native grapes. The lunate zale, another specialist on black cherry. This is the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. It's a specialist on spicebush and its relative sassafras. Here's the phony eye on the prothorax that's supposed to scare the bird into thinking it's a tree snake. It didn't work in this case. The tufted bird dropping moth, another specialist on black cherry. So black cherry is emerging as a really important component of this bird's food web. But these guys are hungry. They need a lot more than that. So let's put some black walnut in the landscape. If we do that, we get the walnut sphinx, the gray edge bomoloca, the black blotch caesura, the bride, all specialists on black walnut. Native maples will give us Plagodes inchworms, the green striped maple worm, the maple bantam dagger moth. Native elms, this is the American elm, give us the four-horned sphinx, the double-toothed prominent, the interrupted dagger moth, and of course, many other species. Remember, 90% of the insects that eat plants are only going to be in your yard to support these birds if you have the plants that they co-evolved with in your yard. So if you want the mustard sallow, you need witch hazel. If you want the hackberry emperor, you need hackberry. If you want Cuculio asteroides, you need native asters. The Arcigera flower moth, the brown-hooded owlet need goldenrod. The hog sphinx, Pandora sphinx, abbot sphinx all need Virginia creeper. The redbud leaf roller needs redbud. The gray furculin needs native willows. The turbulent phosphilla needs greenbrier. And the orange tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red humped oak worm, the orange humped oak worm, the pink striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, lesser oak dagger moth, greater oak dagger moth, streaked dagger moth, afflicted dagger moth, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and hundreds more species depend on oaks. And we need these these insects, not just for the birds. So many other things depend on insects as well, like spiders. Now, I know most people don't like spiders, but look who does. It's the second most important component of bird diets, particularly when they're rearing their young. And they're really important predators as well. You know, we hire Mosquito Joe to kill all of our mosquitoes, which he doesn't do, by the way. When we could just keep these spiders around to catch those mosquitoes. Then you have a lot of insect predators that are part of food webs. They're not going to be there unless you have the herbivores that they're depending on. Frogs eat insects, toads eat insects, all of the amphibians eat insects. So do our lizards, so do our bats, so do our rodents, because they're really good food. Pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef. And insects have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies that are loaded with lipids, high energy compounds that allow these little guys to grow quickly and reproduce quickly, which they want to do because there's a lot of things that eat them as well. But it's the same reason that larger organisms are eating insects. They're just really good food. The skunk is eating a lot of insects. Possums eat a lot of insects. Raccoons eat a lot of insects. Even things we don't think of as insectivores eat a lot of insects, like the red fox. 30% of a red fox's diet is insects. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. So it doesn't matter how big you are. And even if you don't eat insects, you need insects. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. It's a bird predator. And you might think, well, I can get rid of all the insects in my neighborhood and still have sharp-shinned hawks. But think about it, if you get rid of all the birds in your neighborhood, if you get rid of the insects in your neighborhood, you've gotten rid of all the birds and he won't have anything to eat. So he needs insects indirectly. Same thing with the garter snake, particularly when they're adults. When they're young, they do eat insects, but when they're older, they're eating frogs and toads that needed insects to be frogs and toads. So a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. And E.O. Wilson told us decades ago that a world without biological diversity is a world without humans. We need to listen to E.O. So what's happening to the species that rely on insects? Well, we do have a lot of data on birds, very little data on other things, but the birds are in trouble. There's 432 species of North American birds that are now at a risk of extinction, not because there's only 5 left of each species, but because the rate of their decline is so precipitous. That's the signal of impending extinction. We now have 3 billion fewer breeding birds in North America than we had just 50 years ago. Not good. Why can't our parks and our preserves keep all of these species around? I mean, we have these parks and preserves, and that's supposed to be what they're doing. And the answer is they're too small. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down into a little habitat patch, and this is an exaggeration, but the average woodlot size in the state of Delaware is 10 acres. So it's not too big of an exaggeration. But you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Tiny populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why is that? Well, because all populations fluctuate. Good times they go up, bad times they go down. Look in the top line here, that's a large population. If you've got a lot of individuals, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population, these normal fluctuations, you often hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch, and then you're gone. That's called local extinction. Unless you recolonize that, picture a box turtle crossing a major highway. It doesn't happen. That is called local extinction. It's not gonna come back. It's part of the general defaunation of the planet here. It doesn't matter whether there's a few individuals here and there. We're generally taking away the numbers of individuals that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. So the natural areas that we have left in this world, all carved up, are not large enough to sustain the amount of nature that we need them to sustain. And not only are viable habitats fragmented, they're also invaded by plants from other continents. This is a park near me. This is White Clay Creek State Park, right up the road from us. And what you're looking at is a picture I took in March when all of the plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. So every bit of green you see there is from Asia. And what are these plants? They're all escaped ornamentals that we have brought in over the last 100 years. Multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive and porcelain berry and miscanthus and privet and Norway maple and ailanthus and on and on and on. 86% of our woody invasive plants in this country are escapees from our gardens. And of course, these plants haven't been here long enough for our insects to adapt to them, so they're not providing the insect food that runs our ecosystems. And we can measure what happens when we replace native plant communities with plants from outside of local food webs, non-native plants. That's what we've been doing in my lab for the last, who knows what, I don't know, 15, 20 years now. And these are papers that are published if you're interested in looking at it. But most people aren't going to do that. And you know what? I don't want you to listen to me and believe what I'm saying. I want you to test it yourself. I mean, I could be an internet troll, or I could be a Russian spy. Don't believe what you hear. Go out and test it yourself. And you could do it this way. I call this my 12 by 12 experiment. That's 12 feet by 12 feet staked out. Now you get to determine how much life is going to occur in that 12 by 12 space. You can keep it as lawn the way it is right now. You can get on your hands and knees on Wednesday and count all the biodiversity that's in there. Won't take you long. And then, of course, on Saturday, you mow it and kill it all. Or we can put a tree in there. Let's plant a white oak. This is a white oak I planted in my yard from an acorn about 14 years before I took this picture. Let's count the caterpillars that are just on the lower branches of this tree. It fills that 12 by 12 space very nicely. We're not going to get any ladders or anything. We're just going to walk around, count the caterpillars, and we're going to do it on July 25th of 2014. So yes, this tree is 14 years old. And I'm going to find 410 caterpillars from 19 different species. And then I'm going to go back and take that picture immediately after I finish counting those caterpillars and ask you, how many of those caterpillars do you see? None, unless you have very good eyes. How much caterpillar damage do you see? You don't see any caterpillar damage either. But if I knocked on your door and said, you've got 410 caterpillars on your oak tree, most people would get the spray can, call the man, save the tree. Caterpillars are going to kill the tree. No, they're not going to kill the tree. Oaks and most trees are really good at sharing part of the energy they have captured from the sun with the caterpillars and other insects in your yard. And because they're willing to do that, we have other types of life. I met a woman in New Orleans several years ago, Tammany Baumgarten, who suggested we all practice the 10-step program. Take 10 steps back from your trees and all of your insect problems disappear. I think it's good advice. We never view our trees close up. We're always at least 10 steps back. Okay, we're moving on with our experiment here. Let's look at a black cherry. Count the caterpillars on the lower branches. On the same day, 239 caterpillars from 14 different species. Now let's go to my neighbor's house and look at one of his calorie pears, Bradford pears. Calorie pears, of course, are its favorite ornamental for an awful lot of people. It's from Asia. It is a highly invasive species. The first thing we have to do is decide which pear we're going to count, because he's got 32 of them. Let's count this one. Lower branches, just like the other trees, one caterpillar from one species. Now let's move to his burning bush, another highly invasive plant, another plant from Asia. Carve out a 12 by 12 foot section, 4 caterpillars from one species, 4 little leaf miners that are too small to be part of a food web. All right, we've just conducted an experiment. We've compared native plants with non-native plants and whether they support the food web. But we've only done it once. So the results we got could have been just by chance. We have to replicate a number of times. So let's do it again the next day, July 26th. We're going to use the same species, but different individuals. We get the same pattern, different numbers, but the same pattern. 233 caterpillars on the white oak, 53 in the black cherry, 2 in the burning bush, 1 on the calorie pear. And that's the pattern you're going to get no matter how many times you do it. You should do it at least 10 times to see whether this is a real pattern. But these plants, they're not evil plants. They're just out of place. We brought them over from Asia as ornamentals. They're here, and our insects are not adapted to eating them. So they're here, but they're not contributing to local food webs. Several years ago, Rick Darke and I gave a talk in Williamsburg, Virginia. And after the talk, we drove home, we came over the Bay Bridge, across the Chesapeake Bay. And right after you get over the bridge, the first building you get to is the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill. And there were all the calorie pears in full bloom. Very popular ornamental tree. I guess that's the only tree they liked. Okay, we kept driving, and right past the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill is it's a land conservancy property. I found out later. And look, it is thoroughly invaded with the offspring from the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill's calorie pears. That's what an invasive species is. Now you can talk about property rights, that the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill has the right to plant anything they want. Okay, but do they have the right to biologically pollute all the land around them? These invasive species are ecological tumors. They just keep replicating and spreading. And remember, they're not producing the caterpillars that the chickadees or everybody else needs. So they're there, they're occupying space, but they're excluding the native plants that do support the local ecosystems. Roy Dennis is I guess he's a naturalist in Great Britain. And he said not too long ago that land ownership is more than a privilege, it's a responsibility. And I couldn't agree more. It is a responsibility. So how do we exercise that responsibility? We have to know which plants are going to be the most productive in our landscapes. Well, we've created a tool. It's called, it's the Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website. And what it does is rank the woody and herbaceous plant genera in your county. If you put in your zip code, these lists will come up in your county that tell you what are the best plants. We call them keystone plants for supporting the wildlife around you. This is what a typical list would look like for Connecticut. They're much bigger than this, but I stopped because I ran out of room. So notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. If I go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, chances are it'll be a birch tree from Europe. The horticultural trade is loaded with non-native species. We have to specify that you want native members of these very powerful genera. Because if you don't, you're going to have 68% fewer caterpillars on those non-natives, even though they're in the same genus as many of our native trees. These are the most powerful herbaceous plants. You can get both the woodies and herbaceous plants on Native Plant Finder that belong in your county. This is the keystone plant concept. Well, keystone plants are essential in our food webs because they are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. What's the best keystone plant? In 84% of the counties in which they occur, which is over most of North America, it's oaks. In the mid-Atlantic states, and that includes Connecticut, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. Compare that to ginkgos, 0 species. Compare that to our native prunus. This is the second most important plant genus in North America. 456 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic states. Zelkova, another common non-native, supports no caterpillar. So there are huge differences between our natives and the non-natives that we use ornamentally. Pieris japonica used to be the most common foundation plant in North America. We do have native Pieris, but it's not a big genus at all, and it's not very powerful. Only 2 species use our native Pieris. I don't think anything uses Pieris japonica. Could have been a native viburnum that supports 103 species. So think of the plants that you choose to put in your yards as bird feeders. You get to decide how well you're going to feed the birds by choosing the right plants. So there you go. They're bird feeders. You can feed the birds a lot by putting a lot of bird feeders in your yard, or you can feed them very little. This is what most of the yards around me look like. They're giant lawns with very few plants at all in them. You can put food in your bird feeders. or you can keep them empty. Here's the ginkgo back here. It's a big tree, but it's not making any caterpillars. And when we don't landscape with keystone plants, we're not fooling the birds. Here's a little snippet from a study that one of my previous grad students, Desiree Naranjo, did. She looked at how well Carolina chickadees reproduce in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And she looked at a whole bunch of birds over a 5-year period. This is the nest of one pair of chickadees, and the red line here represents the foraging territory of that pair. They forage about 50 meters from the nest. The blue areas represent the plants on which they forage, the ones they got the caterpillars from. So let's see what they are. Well, they're all the native trees in this landscape. There's a basswood, sweet gum, American elm was a big one here, black cherry, and then a couple of species of oaks. But let's also look at the trees that are in this neighborhood that the chickadees did not forage on. And they're all the non-native trees from Asia. Why didn't they forage on those trees? Because there's nothing to eat. Do they know that ginkgos don't produce any food? No, they do go in there once and they look around, there's nothing to eat. So they don't go shopping in ginkgos or black poplars or crepe myrtles any more often than you would go to Safeway if all the shelves were bare. So what Desiree did was ask a simple question. How well do landscapes that are dominated by native plants support chickadee populations over time compared to landscapes that are dominated by introduced plants? And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by native plants, by non-native plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, the amount of bird food is reduced by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. The chickadees came, and there were nest boxes up in each yard, but they looked around and said, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those nests were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all the information together in a population growth model, as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live very long, so you have to make babies to replace them each year. And if you make them at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you produce more babies than adults die, you do have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies than adults die, way down here, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. And notice that's what you get as you increase the percentage of non-native plant biomass in your yard. Right here is where those lines overlap, generously speaking, which suggests you can have up to 30% of the woody plant biomass in your yard non-native without destroying the food web. That's called compromise. And I'm glad we've got some compromise out there, because if my message was you're not allowed to have any non-native plants at all, very few people would be listening. She also counted the number of migrating birds that stopped on these residential landscapes during their migration looking for insects to eat. There were 51 species of them. And if they stopped in an area dominated by ginkgos or other non-natives that aren't making any food, they had nothing to eat. And that really jeopardizes their migration. I don't know if you've ever seen a migrant sitting in a shopping mall parking lot, for example, just sitting there shivering. They're out of gas. They came down and there's nothing to eat, and that's the end of their migration. So you might say, well, my property is not big enough to support breeding birds, and it might not be. But if you're big enough to support the growth of a single tree, you can help migrating birds if you choose the right tree. So it doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live if you have proper plant choice. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about the creation of novel ecosystems. We've moved plants and animals all over the world, mixing species together in ways where they have no evolutionary history together. But what that means is they have not had time to develop the specialized relationships that are nature. We've seen how important those relationships are. And that means when we create novel ecosystems by moving things all over the place, species are disappearing from these ecosystems. which prompts me to ask, how many species do we need? How many species do we need in our local ecosystems? And my answer is we need all of them. We need all of them because biodiversity, the number of species in an ecosystem, creates ecosystem function. It creates the life support systems that keeps us around. We call them ecosystem services. The more species in an ecosystem, the more ecosystem services produced. There was a big study came out in 2005 called the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment, and their very unhappy conclusion is that we have already, as of 2005, degraded Earth's ecosystems by 60%. This is the ocean, by the way. That is not a recycling plant. That's 2005. I'm sure it hasn't gotten any better since then. That's the same as taking planet Earth and shrinking it by 60%. At the same time, we keep increasing our human population. Certainly not a sustainable enterprise. We need to increase the Earth's ability to support life, increase its carrying capacity by putting the plants back, by fixing these degraded ecosystems. It's possible, it's something we can do, but we all need to get busy. It means we've got to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. There are 4 major ecological roles that every landscape has to play. They've got to support life, support the food web around you. They've got to sequester carbon, pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, fix it, pump it into the ground. That's what plants do. Got to clean and manage the watershed in which that landscape lies. That's what plants do. And they've got to support pollinators, not because pollinators are pollinating 30% of our crops. People say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need pollinators. You do need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need where we need plants, we need everywhere we need pollinators, which is everywhere. So what have we been doing for our landscapes? We've been asking them to do one thing, and that is be pretty. It's all been about aesthetics. We go to the nursery and we look for beautiful plants with decorative value. Maybe they could be screens, anchors, or focal points, but it's all been about aesthetics with no thought to the ecological role that these plants need to be playing on our landscapes. And when we think of plants only as decorations, then landscaping typically equals ecological destruction. That's pretty, but it's not a functional ecosystem. We could pick pretty plants that perform the ecosystem services that keep us alive on planet Earth, supporting those food webs, protecting our watersheds, storing carbon, restoring the soil, doing all kinds of things that we need our plants to be doing. And when we add ecological function to the criteria that we're using to select plants, then landscaping equals ecosystem restoration. And I'm calling this 21st century landscaping. We've done 20th century landscaping and we're now in the 6th grade extinction. So that's not working so well. Let's give this a try. We're not talking about good land stewardship here. We're talking about essential land stewardship for our own sakes. So how do we do that? What's a biodiversity friendly neighborhood look like, particularly in the East? Well, we need to do a couple of things. We need to put enough plants back into our landscapes that we create biological corridors that connect natural areas with each other. I mean, that's what your pollinator pathways are all about. We need to do that by reducing the area that's now in lawn. And we need to begin the transition from these non-native ornamental plants to native ornamentals. Let's focus on lawn for a while. We've got 40 million acres of lawn in the US. That's the size of New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. This is what we typically do. We build a house, we put in a few trees and shrubs along the house, then we're exhausted, no more landscaping. So everything by default becomes lawn. What if we turn that on its head? Let's build the house and now figure out where we do want lawn. You want lawn where you're gonna walk. Lawn is the perfect plant to walk on without killing it. So if you want to get married in the front yard, you need some space there. If you want to walk to the backyard, you need a grass path. You want to throw the Frisbee, have a barbecue. Wherever you're going to use the yard, that's where the lawn goes. Then everything by default that you're not using becomes heavily planted. And if everybody around you do that, now you've repopulated your neighborhood. You've built a biological corridor that connects with the woodlot over here and the woodlot over here. You still have lawn, so you can still play with your lawnmower. It'll be okay. But you reverse the outflow of species from your neighborhood, and then they will now start coming to your neighborhood. What if we replanted half those 40 million acres that are now in lawn? What if we planted half of them with productive plants? That would give us 20 million acres to use for conservation. And if we do it at home, we can create what I'm calling homegrown national park, which will be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What if we took areas like this? This is the entrance to the, I guess it's this Cleveland Zoo. And did this. When the zoo did this, the board of directors got really upset. They thought nobody else would want to come to the zoo anymore because they got rid of the lawn. It's hard to change culture. It really is. What if we take these square things here and replant this area? Now that's a healthy yard. This is actually a high-end house. I should have included more of that in the picture. This landscape is doing everything I just described, except supporting the pollinators. So let's add a pollinator garden, and then we're doing all of it. This is the new norm in agriculture. We've got agriculture and all of what used to be weedy roadsides, but that's where the milkweed was, and the asters, and all of the native plants that supported so much of our wildlife throughout tens of thousands of road miles in particularly the Midwest. It's now lawn, but we can replant it. This is a picture from Iowa. They're doing a great job in Iowa and putting back a lot of the native plants that support the prairie ecosystems out there. This is a mulch sculpture, which proves you can't use native plants in a formal design, except nobody told the folks in I think this is St. Louis. Nobody told them you can't use native plants in a formal setting. All these plants are native, and this is the first year of the planting. Can we use natives in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. This is taken from a drone 400 feet up, so it's a big garden, and every single plant in that garden is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Here's a corporate landscape that invites the employees to come out at noon to get sunburn. It could be a landscape like this that not only is beautiful and restful, there are measurable medical benefits from spending just 15 minutes in a landscape like this. A lot of research has gone into this, and it's really interesting. That 15 minutes will lower your blood pressure. It will lower your stress hormone, your cortisol level. It cures your cancer. You don't get divorced anymore. And I'm really not kidding, because the research shows that with lower stress, we do everything better. We are healthier. Our diseases are cured faster. We learn better. When you put trees outside of a classroom, test scores go up. And it's all because we do everything better with lower stress levels. And these types of landscapes lower our cortisol. If you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do that now by going to homegrownnationalpark.org and get yourself on the map. All you're doing, where are we? We're way up here. You're putting your location, the information for your location there, and the amount of area that you are already protecting or you're going to convert into native plantings, and that will add you to the map, and you get to see everybody else who's doing it. The object is to repopulate or show how this idea is spreading virally. We're trying to reach people who don't understand that they have an important role in the future of conservation. And this is our social media approach to doing that. So please, everybody, join the map. It's free. We're not using your data for anything. Does your yard have to be 100% native? No, it doesn't. Remember the research that shows you can have up to 30% non-natives. Of course, the more, the merrier. It is not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So if we get more of those native plants, particularly into the area that's now in lawn, we will vastly increase the productivity of our yards, even though we have some non-natives there. How do you know when you've succeeded? There's a lot of ways to know when you've succeeded, but this is a major one. When you've got holes in your leaves. Greg Nace at the Pittsburgh Botanical Garden calls this holistic gardening. And I love that. This is the shingle oak in my yard, and part of it has been eaten by a caterpillar, and that caterpillar has been eaten by a bird. I've got the bird and the caterpillar because the tree is willing to share part of the energy it captured from the sun. If all of the leaves in your property are perfect decorations, it means that plant is not doing its ecological job. Another key to success is when you have fireflies, particularly in the east, or lightning bugs, depending on what you call them. I hear all the time, oh, I don't see lightning bugs the way I did when I was a child. Why not? This is what a lightning bug looks like. It's not a bug. It's a beetle. It's not a fly. It's a beetle. That's what the larva looks like. They look like little dinosaurs, and they live in the leaf litter on your property. So if you rake up all your leaves and throw them out, you don't have any fireflies. If you have ChemLawn, you've poisoned your fireflies. If you have lights on all the time, you've messed up their adult communication. So if you have fireflies, you're doing a number of things right. But the best way to measure your success is by having breeding birds on your property, right there, because that means there's enough food to sustain them, which means you're doing a number of things correctly. So we can save nature, but only if we learn to live with it. Fortunately, nature is proving to be really malleable. It's resilient, it's forgiving, but it's not endlessly forgiving. I do think she's going to give us one more chance, though. Thanks very much. Go back to here.
Wow. Thank you, Doug, so much. It's fascinating information, a little awe-inspiring, or maybe a lot awe-inspiring. I can't wait to put some of these recommendations into practice. I have been looking and see that there are a few questions in the chat, and we'll start with those. Guests, if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to continue to post them in the chat, or indicate that you'd like to ask a question by hovering over your toolbar where it says reactions and click on raise hand. So I think we have, maybe just short of half an hour to do some questions. And I did take note of the first couple. So Dee has asked in the chat whether birds eat gypsy moth caterpillars, and if so, which birds?
The general answer is no. Birds don't like hairy caterpillars. It's not that they don't like non-native caterpillars, it's that they don't like hairy caterpillars, and gypsy moths are hairy caterpillars. But there are exceptions. There's the yellow-bill and black-bill cuckoo that specialize on hairy caterpillars. They go around and they'll eat the tent caterpillars, they'll eat fall webworm, they'll eat gypsy moths. There are actually populations of cuckoos that follow gypsy moth outbreaks to eat them. The trouble is there's never enough yellow-bill and black-bill cuckoos, so they're certainly not controlling them. And that's because gypsy moths are here without their natural enemies. It's a huge problem, as you all know. Oop, you're muted.
Thanks. Had to happen once, right? Anna asks, are there lists? She was really interested to hear about the sphinx moth that has, one host for its nectar and one host for its larval stage. She said, are there lists that highlight, other pairs of plants that are needed to support species like that?
Well, that was the idea of the native plant finder, is that you would be able to go and see which plants are supporting the most caterpillars. Some of those are generalists, but most of those are specialists that are using those particular plants, so that you could put those plants in and target these particular, they're mostly moths. We haven't done a lot with butterflies yet. Butterflies are actually bad tasting day flying moths. And the reason they're flying during the day when the birds are out is because they don't taste very good. So we really want to increase the moth populations that are hiding, and we see them at night because they're the ones that are providing most of the food. So that material, that information is all buried in that website. I'm thinking about making a talk strictly on specialized relationships, but I haven't gotten a chance to do that yet.
Right. Well, did for sure. Okay. And Yael, I hope I'm getting your pronunciation right, asks, how would you find out this information for Canada? Is there a homegrown national park, or the native plant list for Canada?
The David Suzuki Foundation in Canada is getting Canada on homegrown national park. They're going to open it up to that. We're trying to work out the technical logistics for that. The native plant finder is it took us years to get that information, and it's for the lower 48 states, but it's applicable to all of southern Canada as well. And as you get up into the north, the number of insects drops out largely. You do get some very important insects supporting bird breeding up there, things like the spruce budworm, but the number of species drops way down. So people in Toronto and all of southern Canada, they can use the native plant finder information from New York State, for example, and it'll be very accurate.
Thank you. I have David Burns raised his hand. David, if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Hello. Great talk, thank you. Learned quite a bit. Great pictures of caterpillars. One of the questions I had, so we got a number of acres of pasture here. It was cow pasture. We've been slowly replanting a couple of pollinator meadows, but we do have the challenge that there's a lot of invasives already there. We have multiflora rose. There's, I guess, a non-native loosestrife, other things. It's kind of beyond our ability to manage. There's a couple of us, and we have our full-time day jobs. We do, once a season mows to kind of manage the, keep the multiflora down. What do you do to try and encourage the native plants to come back, as opposed to just letting the non-native stuff go wild? Nothing's eating it.
How many acres do you have?
We've got about 15 acres of pasture. Some of it we do chickens on. The rest of it, we're just trying to figure out how to best deal with it.
Well, it's a big job, and it's one of the huge downsides of these invasives. I would focus on the woodies first because you'll get the biggest impact there. We have 10 acres, and that's what it looked like. It was 100% invaded, and I will just tell you that my skinny little wife, just about by herself, did control all of it. Now, she spent a lot of time doing it. What we do is for the woodies, we cut them off at the base, like multiflora rose, cut it off at the base, and then paint the stump. You've got to kill the rootstocks. Mowing will push it back, but it'll never kill the roots, and it'll come back forever. Same with autumn olive, same with all of those guys. So, but then once they're dead, they're dead. And now at this point, our 10 acres, we have things seeding in from the neighbors, but they're much easier to control. So I would say pick at it. Don't, if you look at the entire job all at once, it's pretty depressing. So just start at a corner and pick at it. You're expanding your territory and protect what you've already expanded. I would love to tell you there's a way to do it without herbicide, but I don't know what it is. If you don't kill the rootstock, they just keep coming back. That's why I paint instead of spray, because spraying always hits non-targets. You want the other things that are desirable to come back, and it uses very little material.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the chat for a couple of questions. Toby asks, do Asian jumping worms spell doom for the fireflies?
I hate to talk about doom. I like to talk about hope. But they're another huge problem. These invasive species are a terrible problem. The Asian jumping worms eat all the leaf litter, and leaf litter is where the fireflies live. Fireflies are predators in leaf litter, in the arthropods in leaf litter. So it is not a good mix. We don't know what to do about the Asian jumping worm. There's 4 species of introduced Chinese worms that are huge problems because they're in the They're annual worms that live in the soil. They overwinter as an egg mass. The birds don't seem to eat them. It's just a huge conundrum. One thing that's a little bit positive, although some people say, oh, it doesn't work, but it's the only thing I've heard of. The worms don't like oak leaf litter. They're too full of tannins and lignins. And so if you increase the percentage of oaks in your property, and there are lots of other reasons to do that, and increase the amount of leaf litter, it depresses the worm populations, and they'll go someplace else. So try that, get that oak leaf litter there. That will certainly support the fireflies. But I wish we had a good solution for it. If somebody can think of it. The people all over the country want that solution.
Okay, thanks. And then another question from the chat. Akiva asks, how would you know that a pollinator garden is beginning to work in its early stages?
Well, watch it when it's in bloom and see what is coming to those flowers. We've got 4,000 species of native bees. We also have one species of honeybee that was brought in for agriculture, and they're very good for many of our crops. And then we've got, there's not that many species of bumblebees. They're generalists as well. So if you look at your pollinator garden and you only have bumblebees and honeybees, you're starting out, you're just starting. What you want to do is plant for the bee specialists. Because if you plant for the bee specialists, the ones that have very specialized relationships with particular pollens, then the generalists will use them as well. So what are the best plants for bee specialists in your area? Goldenrod supports, 14 species of bee specialists. Native asters support another 12. Native willows are very high up there. Sunflowers, perennial sunflowers, very high. With those three genera alone, you can support over 44 species of specialist bees. And the generalist bees will use them as well. So you'll be able to see, in terms of the bee pollinators, success by looking at the numbers of types of bees that are going there. If you're talking about moth pollinators that are doing most of their pollination at night, that's when you find caterpillars. You go out with a flashlight at night and look up in the trees, you see them on the leaves, or they're hanging down on little threads. Again, the simplest way to know whether you're having big success is to see how many breeding birds you have in your yard. If you have that cardinal nest right in your house, that's a good sign.
Great, thank you. I'm going to call on Andrea, who has her hand raised. Andrea, do you want to come off mute?
Hi, Connie. Thanks for doing this wonderful talk. I am feeding my baby. He's very excited about sharing his cheese with everybody on video. And so my question comes from, we just bought a house in Kent. We only have 1/3 of an acre, so we're not gigantic, but more than we've ever had. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I balance grass for this guy to play in safely, but also, or not necessarily grass, like moss, any type of ground cover. So I guess what is sort of the best way to do that, but also balance the cost effectiveness of it? Like when you said, oh, going to a greenhouse, my brain just went dollar signs. And so I'm trying to figure out how do I support a future for him and our world, but also, have money for basic things too.
Well, that 10 acres that we own that I've talked about, we haven't spent any money buying plants. So it doesn't have to cost a lot. You can plant an oak tree by finding an acorn and put it in the ground. That's free. You can plant an oak tree or a beech tree by clearing a little patch of ground, maybe 2 square feet, making it disturbed, because that is where the blue jays will bring in the acorns and the beech nuts and bury them, and they'll sprout up yourself. We discovered that. We didn't know that was happening, but blue jays are moving a lot of seeds around. Of course, your squirrels and things are bringing in walnuts and hickories from your neighbor's house. So a lot of things will come up on their own without you having to spend any money at all. I get it that you want room for him to run around and play, but you know what? In 15 years, you're not going to need that room anymore. So I would say at this point, just go slowly, plant a single tree. And that still gives him plenty of room, but that tree is going to grow a lot in that 15 years. And then you can add over time. It sounds like a long time, but boy, it goes by really fast. So don't worry about doing it overnight. Just if you have a conservation mindset now, I'm happy, because that, you can vote appropriately. It doesn't mean you have to completely convert your property to be successful. Just think about your role in conservation, and you will do things that improve things. And then as you get older and less time with the little one, you'll have more time to put into it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. All right, I'm going back to the chat box. This is a question from Lori Doss, who is a director on the Kent Land Trust. And Lori says, so many land trusts save property, but just let the forest regenerate. How would you advise land trusts to manage their properties to enhance biodiversity over time?
Well, this is one of the, I would say this is the biggest challenge for land trusts that already own property. It's all been about acquiring the property and protecting it legally, but rarely do they have the resources to actually manage it. And managing it with our invasive species load, we've got 3,300 species of plants that are invasive in this country. It's a tremendous undertaking, and an awful lot of land trusts, are struggling for the resources to do that. Many of them do it through volunteer associations. They have organized volunteers that have work days that help remove invasives and do what needs to be done. But that's one of the biggest challenges for land trusts is managing the land, because unfortunately, today, just leaving a piece of property, let it go, it's going to be thoroughly invaded with the bad guys in very short order. And another huge problem. So how, we know how to manage it, is getting the resources to do that. That is the big challenge.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to our one remaining hand raise, and that is Shelley Harms. Shelley, if you want to come off mute, and then we have a few more questions in chat, so we'll get to as many as we can. But go ahead, Shelley, please.
Thank you. This is such a great talk, and I love Bringing Nature Home is like my favorite book. My church green group is trying to get the church to remove 3 Norway maples and replace them with natives. And we have some resistance from the congregation. And so I wonder if you can tell me, why should they take them out and put native plants in their place? How would we persuade them?
Are these huge trees?
One is very large, and the 2 of them are not very large.
Of course, it's expensive to take out a big tree. I would focus on the not very large ones, because that's going to be cheaper. They're just not contributing. They are invasive. They throw heavy shade. Very few things can grow underneath them. When they penetrate a natural area, they tend to take it over because of that heavy shade. Very few things can, those caterpillars aren't developing on Norway maples. So they're occupying space, but they're not contributing to, this is your congregation. They are not helping God's creatures. You've got landscape, and what you're doing is preventing the other species from being happy there with those Norway maples. I do realize that it's an investment to get rid of a big tree like that. So I would focus on maybe, over time, one small tree at a time. Make sure you replace it with a keystone plant. And again, I would recommend an oak, because they're going to contribute more than anything else. But, it might be an easier sell rather than saying we're going to get rid of all of them at once. What they probably don't want is a big bare space. So one thing you could do is plant replacement trees now, let them get some size, and then take those trees down when it wouldn't be such a big empty space, because the other trees are already established. course, think about the process of taking down the tree. You don't want to have the new tree right next to the old tree because it's going to be very hard to take it down without squishing it. So, but that's what I would recommend. Give them a copy of Bringing Nature Home or Nature's Best Hope and see if they get convinced.
We sent around your one of your talks, a recording, and told them all to watch it.
Okay, good. That'll
Thank
work.
you. That's helpful.
Great. Okay, from the chat box, Jason, who is joining us all the way from Seattle, Washington, says, can you speak to the West Coast oaks?
The only oak you have in Seattle, Washington is the Oregon oak, or Quercus garryana. It's in the white oak group. It's a wonderful oak. It has lost, 97% of its range. Used to be from Central California all the way up through Washington, but it grew in the areas that are perfect for agriculture. There are areas where you have a lot of large, the big oak, the oaks that are left are often very large, but recruitment is low. Nobody's letting these guys seed in so that you have young oaks coming up to replace them. So if I lived on the West Coast, I would focus on getting a new generation of the Oregon white oak into the landscape to replace those big guys as they come down. But that is the oak that you have up there, which makes it simple. You can target it very, very easily. It's a keystone species there, just as oaks are every other place. So.
Thanks. All right. I think we're going to take maybe one more question, and this is again from the chat box. Katie Fragging has asked, I've got 3 fields. Hold on, I have a box in the way. I've scraped off the top of one and added seed. I've just plowed and seeded one, and then I've just let one go but planted plugs in it, and none of these have given natives a big boost. So what would be your suggestions for what she could try next?
Yeah, a lot of people say, well, I'll just stop mowing and I'll have a nice meadow. But creating a meadow is actually one of the hardest things to do for exactly that reason. You've got to replace the plants that are there with the ones that you want to be there. There's a cheap way to encourage the native plants, and that is simply with your mowing schedule, where you mow heavily in the spring, right through May, and then you stop mowing. You don't mow the rest of the year. And you do that for several years in a row, and it's going to encourage the warm season bunch grasses to come in and discourage the cool season European grasses. You may have had, I don't know when you planted your seeds, but you may have had more success than you think, because the first year after you planted native plants, many of them are, like they're an inch tall, and you don't recognize them as anything more than little teeny things. So most people think they've totally failed. It takes 3 years to see real success after a seeding of a new meadow. If you are fairly well off, you can hire Larry Weiner, who is excellent at creating meadows. He's been doing it for 30 years, and he will give you a beautiful landscape in short order, but he's not free. Larry Weiner Associates.
Thank you. Well, I think that our time is just about up. Thank you so much, Doug. We've learned a ton and have a lot to think about, a lot to be hopeful about, and also maybe a lot to do in order to get ready for our next gardening season. So we really appreciate it. And, I hope that you've made, quite a few fans tonight. Like I said in my beginning introduction, I think that all of us, want to do the right thing, and we're very thirsty for this information. So we sure appreciate it.
Well, you're quite welcome. I apologize for getting kicked off. I got to figure out why that happened. That's the second time that's happened. That really throws me. So thank you for sticking around, and we'll fix it in the future. All right. Take care, everybody.